November 3, 1946. 14:15 hours. Former RAF station, Bedfordshire, England. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway of what had been designated Hut 7, Section B, and tried not to cry. Behind her, a lorry idled with the few possessions she and her husband had salvaged from their bombed house in Portsmouth, a tea service that had belonged to her grandmother, some clothes, a few photographs, William's D-Mob suit still in its wrapping. Inside the hut, bare corrugated steel curved overhead in a half-cylinder that looked more like a storage shed than a home. The floor was concrete. A single small stove sat in the center, its chimney pipe extending through a hole cut in the steel roof. Two narrow windows admitted gray November light that did nothing to warm the space. This was it. This was where they would live, where they would try to build a life after 6 years of war that had killed Margaret's brother, wounded her husband, and destroyed the home they'd bought 3 years into their marriage. A curved steel tube, 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, divided by plywood partitions into 3 flats that shared the same cold space and single coal stove. No running water inside, that came from a pump outside that served the entire row of huts. Toilet facilities in a separate structure, 50 yards away. William came up behind her, limping slightly from the wound that had sent him home from Italy in 1944. He looked at the hut, at his wife's face, and tried to find something encouraging to say. "Well," he managed finally, "at least it's not raining inside." Margaret laughed, a sound somewhere between humor and despair. "No," she agreed, "at least there's that." The contrast was impossible to ignore. 18 months ago, the streets of London had filled with crowds celebrating Victory in Europe Day. People had danced, strangers had embraced. Churchill had promised that Britain's finest hour would lead to brighter days ahead. Margaret had stood among the celebrating masses, William beside her in uniform, and believed that the hard part was over. Now she stood in a military hut on the edge of a Bedfordshire airfield, watching her breath mist in the cold air, and understood that victory was only half the story. The hut was 16 feet by 12 feet, their portion of it anyway. Smaller than their front room had been in Portsmouth. The walls were corrugated iron, painted a dull green that had probably looked smart when the RAF used it for storage or enlisted men's quarters, but now just looked dreary. The plywood partition separating their space from the next flat was thin enough that Margaret could hear voices through it, a woman's and a child's, discussing something in tones too low to make out words, but loud enough to confirm that privacy would be a memory, not a reality. She stepped inside. The concrete floor was cold even through her shoes. She could feel it radiating upward, a chill that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The stove sat unlit, a small black cylinder with a pipe extending through the roof. It would need coal, which would need to be carried from wherever coal was stored. It would need lighting, tending, feeding constantly to maintain even marginal warmth. And it would serve 3 families, which meant negotiation, coordination, compromise. The windows were small, 2 feet by 3 feet at most, positioned high on the curved walls. They let in light but offered no view except gray sky. Margaret wondered if they opened. She wondered how much good it would do if they did. William began unloading boxes from the lorry, carrying them inside with the careful movements of a man whose body no longer worked quite right. His limp was worse when he was tired or when the weather was cold. Today, it was both. He set down a crate containing their pots and pans, looked around the hut, and said nothing. Margaret tried to imagine where things would go. The tea service on what? There were no shelves. The clothes in where? There was no wardrobe. The bed would take up most of the space. And they'd need to build it or acquire it because they certainly hadn't been able to salvage one from Portsmouth. How do you live here? Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. The question formed itself without invitation, not rhetorical, not despairing, simply practical. How do you cook on a shared stove? How do you wash without running water? How do you stay warm when winter comes, truly comes, with January cold, not just November gray? How do you maintain dignity when the toilet is 50 yards away and shared with strangers? How do you make this curved metal shell, this leftover of war, this thing that was never meant to be a home, into something worth living in? Margaret didn't have answers. But standing in the doorway of Hut 7 Section B, with the gray afternoon fading toward evening and the lorry driver waiting to be paid, she understood that finding those answers would be her work now, not someday, not when things improved, now. She picked up the crate with her grandmother's tea service and carried it inside. The arithmetic of destruction. Britain emerged from World War II militarily victorious and domestically devastated in ways that statistics couldn't fully capture. The bombing campaign that Germany had waged against British cities from 1940 through 1945 had destroyed or seriously damaged approximately 4 million homes. London alone had lost roughly 1/3 of its housing stock to bombs and fires. Coventry's city centre had been obliterated in November 1940. Hull, Plymouth, Bristol, Southampton, Birmingham. Every major city and many smaller ones bore scars from bombing that had killed 60,000 British civilians and left hundreds of thousands homeless. The damage wasn't just physical. Britain's economy was exhausted, its resources depleted by 6 years of total war. The nation had spent everything to survive and prevail, leaving almost nothing for reconstruction. Building materials were scarce. Timber needed for pit props in coal mines, steel required for rebuilding industry. Cement rationed for critical infrastructure projects. Skilled construction workers were still being demobilized from military service, returning to the civilian economy gradually. The housing shortage wasn't just a matter of damaged buildings, but a fundamental inability to rebuild quickly enough to meet need. The mathematics were brutal. Britain needed millions of new homes, but could build perhaps 100,000 per year, using traditional construction methods with available resources. At that rate, the housing shortage would persist for decades, leaving families in temporary accommodation, or worse, through children's entire childhoods. The crisis demanded solutions that were immediate, even if imperfect. Solutions that could be implemented quickly with available resources. That would provide shelter now, rather than ideal housing eventually. The inventor's practical mind. The Nissen hut, named for its designer Major Peter Norman Nissen of the Royal Engineers, represented military engineering's approach to solving problems. Identify minimum requirements, design the simplest possible solution, make it producible and transportable. Nissen had developed the design in 1916 during World War I, when British forces in France needed shelter that could be erected quickly behind lines, transported easily, and constructed by soldiers with minimal training and tools. His solution was elegantly simple: a semi-cylindrical structure of corrugated iron sheets bolted to a steel frame, with wooden end walls containing door and window openings. The curved shape provided strength, like an arch, distributing loads efficiently, while the corrugated iron was readily available, lightweight, and weatherproof. A team of 6 men could erect a standard hut in 4 hours using only wrenches and basic hand tools. The design proved so successful that it remained essentially unchanged through World War II. The British military produced Nissen huts by the thousands, shipping them worldwide to every theater where British forces operated. In North Africa, they withstood desert heat and sandstorms. In the Arctic, they provided shelter against brutal cold. In the Pacific, they resisted tropical humidity and monsoons. They served as barracks, hospitals, mess halls, command posts, storage facilities, workshops, churches, cinemas. Any function requiring covered space could be accommodated by appropriate arrangement and fitting out of the basic structure. The hut's military service revealed both strengths and weaknesses that would later matter for civilian use. They were indeed quick to erect and required no specialized construction skills. They were durable. Properly assembled and maintained, they lasted years despite being classified as temporary structures. They were adaptable. Interior arrangements could be modified easily to suit different purposes. But they were also deeply uncomfortable. The metal construction conducted heat readily, making them ovens in summer and freezers in winter unless insulated and heated continuously. Condensation formed on interior surfaces in humid conditions, dripping from walls and ceilings. The curved walls made furniture arrangement difficult and reduced usable floor space. They were noisy in rain or wind, the metal drumming and rattling in ways that made sleep difficult. For military use, these disadvantages were acceptable. Soldiers could be ordered to live in uncomfortable quarters, and military facilities provided communal services that reduced individual huts' deficiencies. But converting these structures to family housing would require addressing their worst characteristics while accepting that perfection wasn't achievable given resource constraints and the urgency of need. From camps to communities. By 1945, Britain hosted approximately 400,000 German and Italian prisoners of war in camps scattered across the country, most consisting primarily of Nissen huts arranged in organized layouts with communal facilities. As these prisoners were gradually repatriated through 1946 and 1947, their camps became available for other uses. Simultaneously, military bases were closing as forces demobilized, releasing thousands of additional Nissen huts that had housed British service members. The government's emergency housing program, announced in 1944 and expanded after war's end, designated many of these sites for conversion to temporary civilian accommodation. The camp's existing infrastructure, roads, water supply, sewage, electricity where available, made them practical choices despite their often remote locations. Converting them required relatively modest investment. Partitioning huts into family units, installing cooking facilities, providing furniture and basic amenities, improving insulation and heating where possible. The standards varied considerably. Some conversions were thoughtful and relatively comfortable. Huts properly insulated, equipped with decent stoves, provided with adequate furniture and facilities. Others were barely modified from military specification, with families expected to make do with minimal heating, shared facilities, and improvised domestic arrangements. The solution wouldn't be elegant or permanent, but it would be fast and functional, precisely what circumstances required. Structures built to shelter soldiers would now shelter families. What had been temporary military accommodation would become temporary civilian housing. Temporary, the government promised, for 5 years at most. History would decide otherwise. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to WW2 Archives Declassified. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. Making do. The process of turning military structure into home required creativity, determination, and acceptance that comfort would be relative rather than absolute. Margaret attacked their space with energy, born from relief at having any home at all. The concrete floor was cold and hard, so she and William scrounged linoleum from a salvage yard in the nearby town, patching together enough to cover most of the floor. The corrugated walls were depressing bare metal, so Margaret made curtains from parachute silk that William had acquired through mysterious military surplus channels, hanging them to soften the space and provide some sound dampening. They built simple furniture from scavenged wood, shelves for their few possessions, a table and chairs made from ammunition crates and rough lumber, a partition screen to separate sleeping area from living space. The coal stove became center of domestic life and constant source of anxiety. It needed feeding every few hours to maintain minimal warmth, consuming coal allocated through rationing that never quite seemed sufficient. On the coldest winter nights, ice formed on interior walls despite the stove's best efforts, and families woke to frozen water in basins. Margaret learned to bank the fire carefully at night, achieving a slow burn that lasted until morning rather than a hot fire that exhausted coal supply but left them cold by dawn. She learned which positions near the stove were warmest, arranging their limited furniture to maximize benefit from its heat. Water management required careful planning. The pump outside served multiple families and froze regularly in winter, requiring someone to thaw it each morning by wrapping it in rags soaked with hot water carried from someone's stove. Margaret established a routine: fill kettle and pots each morning for the day's cooking and washing, minimizing trips outside in bad weather. Laundry was a particular challenge. Washing clothes required heating substantial water, performing the wash, then drying clothes in space that was already cramped. She learned to do laundry on days when weather permitted hanging clothes outside, and to arrange drying racks near the stove on wet days, even though this made the space nearly unbearable with humidity. Cooking on the coal stove required relearning techniques Margaret had used as a child before her family had acquired a proper cooker. The stove's top surface served as cooking area, with temperature controlled by adjusting coal feed and positioning pots nearer or farther from the hottest spots. She couldn't bake. No oven existed, so she learned to steam puddings and make stovetop dishes that stretched limited ingredients. But gradually, through months of effort and adjustment, Hut 7, Section B became recognizable as home. Margaret's curtains softened the metal walls. Photographs of family and William's unit in Italy created focal points of memory and identity. The tea service that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother sat on their homemade shelf, providing connection to the destroyed house and to the normality they were trying to rebuild. Small touches: a rug near the door, plants in tin cans on the windowsill, William's careful lettering on a wooden sign reading "The Whitmores," transformed anonymous military structure into space that was theirs, however imperfect. The community of necessity. Their neighbors in the other sections of Hut 7 became immediately important to survival and sanity. The Johnsons had 2 small children and consequently commanded priority access to the water pump for washing. The Patel family, recently arrived from India where Mr. Patel had served in the Indian Army, navigated British winter with good humor and shared techniques for staying warm that they'd learned in Himalayan mountain stations. Everyone helped everyone else because no family could manage in isolation. Watching children while mothers queued for rations. Sharing fuel when someone ran short before the next allocation. Lending tools and expertise for the endless small repairs that communal living demanded. Neighbors shared recipes and techniques, a collective education in poverty cooking that many had last employed during the Depression years before the war. The communities that formed in these temporary housing settlements developed their own characters and social structures. Residents organized committees to manage shared facilities and advocate with authorities for improvements. They established systems for maintaining order and cleanliness in communal areas. They created social activities, community meetings, children's activities, celebrations of holidays and milestones that helped transform collections of huts into actual communities. Children adapted most readily, finding advantages adults couldn't see. The open areas between huts became playgrounds where dozens of children could play together, supervised casually by mothers whose huts all faced the common area. The strange architecture became setting for elaborate games. Huts transformed into spaceships or submarines or castles depending on children's imaginations. Kids who might have grown up in separate houses instead formed tight-knit groups, forged by shared experience of growing up in what they called Tin Town. Adults found adaptation harder but managed through necessity. Men returning from military service had experience with rough living and communal arrangements that helped them adjust. Women who bore primary responsibility for maintaining households under these difficult conditions developed expertise and resilience that their pre-war lives might not have demanded. Elderly residents struggled most. The cold was harder on older bodies, the physical demands of hauling water and fuel more difficult, the lack of privacy more wearing. Communities generally rallied to help their oldest residents, but the conditions were undeniably hard on those least equipped to endure them. Across Britain, similar transformations were occurring in thousands of huts as families adapted to circumstances that were simultaneously impossible and unavoidable. The temporary that lasted. The huts had been designated emergency accommodation, expected to serve 5 years at most while proper housing was constructed. Reality proved different. Britain's post-war recovery was slower than optimists had hoped. Economic austerity persisted through the late 1940s. Building materials remained scarce. Traditional house construction proceeded but couldn't keep pace with demand from population growth, household formation, and continued replacement of war damage. The temporary huts that were supposed to last until 1950 were still housing families in 1955, and some remained occupied into the 1960s. The Whitmores lived in Hut 7, Section B, for 9 years. Their first child was born in 1948, delivered in the local hospital, but brought home to the hut that Margaret had somehow made welcoming despite its limitations. The baby's arrival made the space impossibly cramped. Where did one put a cot, change nappies, store baby clothes in 16 by 12 feet already filled with adult life? Margaret made it work through organization that bordered on obsessive, through accepting that nothing could be left out casually, through learning to function in space that allowed no margin for disorder. The cot fit, barely, against one wall. Nappies hung on lines, strung across the ceiling when weather prevented outdoor drying. Baby clothes occupied a drawer in the makeshift dresser William had built, displacing Margaret's own things to a box stored under the bed. The child's crying echoed through the thin plywood partitions. Mrs. Johnson, whose own children were older now, offered sympathetic looks and occasional child-minding. Mr. Patel's wife brought dishes from recipes adapted to rationed ingredients, ensuring Margaret ate properly while managing infant care and household maintenance. The community that had formed around shared hardship expanded to accommodate new life, as it had done before and would do again. Incremental improvements. Meanwhile, the Whitmores improved their hut incrementally, investing in a space they'd been told was temporary, but increasingly understood was not. Better insulation, purchased and installed over several months, made winter marginally more bearable. A small paraffin heater, acquired at great expense, supplemented the coal stove on bitter nights when the single stove couldn't warm 3 families adequately. The original scrounged linoleum wore through and was replaced, properly this time, with material purchased from a shop rather than salvage yard. Margaret's parachute silk curtains gave way to proper fabric, bought at what seemed an extravagant cost, but justified by the years they'd likely hang there. William planted flowers outside their door each spring, creating a small garden that softened the military precision of the hut rows. Each improvement represented both investment and resignation. Investment in making daily life more comfortable. Resignation that daily life would continue here longer than promised, longer than seemed fair, longer than anyone had planned. William found work at a local factory, walking 3 miles each direction because they couldn't afford a bicycle. His wages were modest but steady, allowing them to save small amounts toward an eventual proper house. The savings accumulated slowly, a few shillings here, a pound there, always less than hoped because children needed shoes and the stove needed coal and the paraffin heater needed fuel and life required money faster than factory wages provided it. Deferred promises. They applied repeatedly for council housing, their names added to waiting lists that seemed never to advance. Each application required forms, documentation, interviews with housing officers who asked intrusive questions about income and family size and why they couldn't simply make do where they were. Each rejection, phrased as deferral, as not yet, as your case is under consideration, arrived with explanations about priorities and point systems and families in greater need. Margaret stopped asking when their turn would come. The question produced only frustration and answers that meant nothing, soon stretched from months to years. Temporary became a word that had lost all meaning. Other families in the settlement received allocations and moved out, their departures celebrated and envied in equal measure. New families moved into the vacated huts, beginning their own temporary stays that would stretch beyond reason. The turnover created strange temporal layers. Families who'd arrived in 1946 living beside families who'd arrived in 1952, veterans of hut life alongside newcomers still shocked by the corrugated walls and shared pumps. The settlement itself evolved. Vegetable gardens appeared between huts. Someone organized a lending library using donated books stored in an unused storage hut. Children who'd been infants when their families arrived now attended the local school, indistinguishable from town children except by address. The huts weathered and aged. Paint flaking, roofs requiring more frequent repairs but remaining fundamentally sound. The government's promises receded into bureaucratic vagueness. 5 years became as soon as possible, became when resources permit, became silence. The huts simply stood, sheltering families who'd been told not to settle in, but had no choice except to make lives in spaces that were never supposed to contain them this long. Time expanded, the temporary endured, and families like the Whitmores learned to measure their lives not in the months until proper housing arrived, but in the years already spent in corrugated steel cylinders that had become, against all intention and expectation, home. The final transition. When the Whitmores finally received allocation for a council house in 1955, Margaret's reaction was complex rather than simple joy. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, official ministerial letterhead announcing what they'd waited 9 years to hear. A 2-bedroom house on the new estate being built on the town's eastern edge, proper brick construction, separate bedrooms, indoor plumbing, central heating, a garden with a fence around it. Move-in date, April 15th. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it on the table and stared at the corrugated walls she'd lived behind for nearly a decade. This was what they'd wanted, what they'd applied for repeatedly, waited for endlessly, saved toward hopelessly. The house represented everything the hut wasn't: permanence, comfort, normality. The life they'd expected to live before the war disrupted everything. The home their son, now 7 years old, deserved. She should have felt elated. She felt unsettled. William's reaction was simpler. "Finally," he said, reading over her shoulder. "Finally, Margaret, a proper house." His voice carried relief so profound it bordered on exhaustion, as though he'd been holding his breath for 9 years and could finally let it out. The news spread through the settlement within hours. Mrs. Johnson appeared at their door that afternoon with tea and congratulations that didn't quite hide the envy underneath. "You deserve it," she said, meaning it and resenting it simultaneously. "God knows you've waited long enough." Her own family had been there 8 years and had received no allocation letter. Mr. Patel shook William's hand warmly. "Good fortune to you both," he said. "You were good neighbors, better than we had right to expect when we first arrived." His family had been allocated housing 6 months earlier and would be moving out the following week, their section of Hut 7 soon to house yet another family beginning their temporary stay. Leaving home. The process of packing exposed how thoroughly they'd settled into space they'd been told was temporary. 9 years of accumulation filled boxes that hadn't existed when they'd arrived with a single lorry load. Clothes their son had outgrown, books borrowed and never returned. Kitchen implements acquired gradually to supplement the few they'd brought from Portsmouth. The furniture William had built from scavenged wood, too crude for the new house but too meaningful to abandon easily. Margaret took down the curtains she'd made from parachute silk, then replaced with proper fabric. She wrapped her grandmother's tea service, which had sat on the homemade shelf through every season of their stay. She packed photographs from the walls, leaving pale rectangles on the corrugated metal where they'd hung. Their son, who'd lived his entire conscious life in the hut, seemed confused by the move. "But this is our house," he said, watching his mother pack. "Why are we leaving our house?" "We're getting a better house," Margaret explained. "A bigger house, with your own room." "I don't want my own room," he said. "I want to stay here." Children adapted most readily to the huts, she remembered thinking years ago. Apparently they also resisted leaving most stubbornly. The day they moved, neighbors gathered to help load their possessions and say goodbye. The Johnsons, still waiting for their own allocation. The new family in the Patel's old section, bewildered recent arrivals trying to navigate community dynamics they didn't yet understand. Others from adjacent huts, people whose names Margaret knew, whose children had played with hers, whose struggles had paralleled her own through years of shared endurance. Mrs. Johnson cried, though she insisted it was just dust in her eyes. Mr. Patel, present for the morning before his own family's departure, shook William's hand again and said simply, "You were good neighbors." Margaret looked back once as the lorry pulled away. The hut stood as it had stood when they'd arrived, curved corrugated steel, small windows, chimney pipe extending through the roof. Someone else would move into their section within weeks. Someone else would hang curtains and arrange furniture and try to make steel into something resembling home. Someone else would wait years for proper housing while living in space designated temporary. What remained? The new house was everything promised. Brick walls that didn't conduct cold, windows that admitted light without admitting wind. Plumbing that meant no more trips to outdoor pumps. Central heating that meant no more anxious coal rationing. Space enough that their son could play without disturbing adults. That possessions could be stored rather than constantly moved. Margaret should have felt only relief. Instead, she felt unmoored. The house was better in every measurable way, yet she found herself missing the particular creak of the hut door, the sound of Mrs. Johnson's voice through the thin partition, the morning ritual of walking to the pump with neighbors. She'd spent 9 years learning to live in impossible conditions. Now she had to learn to live in normal ones, and the adjustment felt stranger than it should have. Across Britain, this scene repeated thousands of times through the 1950s and early 1960s as families graduated from temporary huts to permanent housing. Some settlements were demolished entirely, the huts dismantled or repurposed. Others lingered, partially occupied, gradually deteriorating. A few huts were purchased by their occupants and modified extensively into acceptable permanent homes, properly insulated, connected to utilities, made comfortable through investment the government had never authorized but couldn't prevent. The unglamorous truth. Hut 7, Section B, stood empty after the Whitmores left. Margaret didn't know what happened to it. She couldn't bring herself to ask. Within months, another family would occupy it, or it would be demolished, or it would simply stand vacant, waiting. The Nissen huts weren't triumph of British ingenuity or testament to resilient spirit, though they were evidence of both. They were pragmatic response to desperate circumstances. Temporary measures that became semi-permanent because rebuilding a nation proved harder and slower than anyone had hoped. The families who lived in them did so because they had no choice, making the best of situations that were genuinely difficult while waiting for better options that came slowly, or sometimes not at all. What remained after the huts were gone was memory of a time when British families had survived in corrugated steel cylinders, had made homes from military structures, had raised children and built lives in spaces that should have been temporary but became defining experiences. Not glory, but endurance. Not heroism, but determination. Not grand narrative, but simple truth of people doing what they had to do because the alternative was unthinkable. The ugly huts that nobody wanted became homes because homes were what people made them, through effort and love and refusal to give up, even when circumstances seemed impossible. That was Britain after the war, not glamorous, not comfortable, just persistent, carrying on through hardship until something better became possible. The Nissen huts, ugly and inadequate and somehow sufficient, stood as monuments to that persistence until they were finally, mercifully, replaced by the proper houses that should have been built years earlier, but somehow never were until far too late for those who'd needed them most. Don't just watch, subscribe. Help www.archives. Declassified hit 1,000 subscribers.